Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're talking about critical approaches, critical perspectives, and today we're talking about formalist criticism. Formalist criticism is also called new criticism, and there's frankly a reason for that. With the development of various critical approaches, including various cultural responses to things, obviously feminist response, psychoanalytical response, and various reader responses, writers themselves began to become more than a little bothered, perhaps even incensed, with the notion that people were translating their works out of the context that the person simply sat down and wrote a song, simply sat down and wrote a story, simply sat down and painted a painting or made a movie. And what it was is they felt that critics were reading too much into the work that was not intended by the author. And of course the psychoanalytical critic would say, of course you didn't mean that. To that end, they developed an approach to translation which they call formalist criticism because it has to do with the form of the work. Also called new criticism because while it seems to be in some ways one of the most basic forms of analysis, it actually, as a formalized way of analyzing things, is actually relatively new compared to some of these other criticisms. And essentially it's this. Formalist criticism is a critical perspective that essentially requires the critic, you, the observer, to merely look at the words on the page. You do not take into account who wrote it, when it was written, anything that happened in the author's life, anything that goes beyond basic symbolism, irony, and conflict, and setting, and theme, and narrative perspective, which are all elements that are standard for English 101 at this here fine institution. In other words, this is basic freshman composition stuff. For when you get into the critical perspectives, formalist criticism is mentioned, especially in my class, as a starting point because most people who are in English 103, who have taken English 101, know how to do that basic analysis, and we use that as a starting point. But essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the way the author constructed the work intentionally. The author put in the characters, and so you'd evaluate character, things like whether the characters are round or flat, or whether they evolve, whether they have internal conflicts. You'd look at the basic conflicts within the story, internal conflicts, external conflicts, man versus nature, man versus society, those kinds of things. You also look at the ironies, dramatic irony, verbal irony, situational irony, all revolving around what the characters are doing within the plot. And it's all kind of held within the construction of the plot itself, of the story itself, and you do not bring in any external information other than direct literary analysis of the work. In other words, you would get into EBSCOhost, you get into Gale Literature Resource Center, and you do a search that includes the title of the work, maybe the author of the work, and then a word like symbol or irony or conflict, and you'd find these formalistic elements, and the critics would essentially be discussing how the author put this together with the intention of having a character say something ironic, or having the character do something symbolic, or having the names be symbolic, and what have you. Formalist criticism is especially important because what it does, it forces the reader to not simply retell the plot. It forces them to do some level of analysis. But it's especially important to authors because authors sometimes do simply want to write a story. They come up with an idea and they create it, and they don't want it psychoanalyzed. They don't want it translated by a culture that might be hostile to the idea when the author didn't mean that at all. Instead, what the authors are saying with formalist criticism essentially is just read the words on the page and follow the story. If you like it, fine. If you don't like it, fine. But don't read a bunch of stuff into it by doing these other critical analyses. If you're in English 101, formalist criticism is what you'll be doing for my class. If you're in any other of my literature courses, actually, I don't allow you to do formalist criticism for any written work. And here's why. Because you've already done an entire semester of it in English 101, and you should already know how to do that. We will use it as part of our conversation to establish what the storyline is in a poem or a play or a fiction piece. However, you're not going to be writing about it within my class. But other classes will not only allow you to do this, they'll require it. So you should know the elements of formalist new criticism. And of course, when somebody says formalist or from a new critical perspective, what is this? They're talking about formalist criticism, the basic symbolism, irony, conflict, setting, all that stuff. Okay? Stay in touch.